Hello everyone and welcome to Tech with NK. In this video, I'll propose a solution to the exercise requesting a vanity plate from CS50's Introduction to Programming with Python. I'm going to show you how I did this exercise. However, I just hope to provide you with a few tips or ideas that you could use when solving this exercise later on your own. So that said, let's look at the exercise and see what's expected from us. So we are expected to create a Python file, we call it plates.py, and re-implement vanity plates from problem set 2, restructuring your code per the below. That's with the function main, another function is valid, and call main at the end of the code. Wherein is valid still expects a string as input and returns true if that string meets all requirements and false if it does not. But main is only called if the value of underscore underscore name underscore underscore is equal to underscore underscore main underscore underscore. Then in the file called test underscore plates.py, we are to implement 4 or more functions that collectively test our implementation of is valid thoroughly, each of whose names should begin with test underscore so that we can execute the test with pytest of test underscore plates.py. We've been given a few hints in here, but there's not really a lot. We've just been told to import plates, and we can import isValid directly using this line of code and to make sure to return instead of print. We are expected to create a folder, we'll call it test underscore plates, cd into that folder and create the file test underscore plates.py. And it's in this same file that we're supposed to create plates, or rather re-implement plates.py. And how do we go ahead to test our code? We are supposed to run our file test underscore plates.py with pytest twice. The first time, everything should work just fine, and the second time, we are expected to introduce some bugs into our program and make sure that pytest is able to catch those errors. Then correct everything before submitting our exercise. But before I go on to write the code in VS Code, I want us to go back to this exercise vanity plates and see what a valid plate looks like. And from this exercise, we can see that the requirements for a valid vanity plate will be: the first, all vanity plates must start with at least 2 letters. Next, vanity plates may contain a maximum of 6 characters, letters or numbers, and a minimum of 2 characters. Next, numbers cannot be used in the middle of a vanity plate. They can come at the end. For example, AAA222 would be an acceptable vanity plate, but AAA22AA will not be acceptable. The first number used cannot be a 0. This is another requirement. And the last requirement would be no periods, spaces, or punctuation marks are allowed. This is important because we're going to write our test around these requirements. And with that said, I think the exercise is clear enough, and I'll just go to VS Code and we're going to solve it together. So there are 2 ways we can go about solving this exercise. The first thing we could do is to go back to our implementation of plates.py from previous videos, copy the code there and paste it in these other plates.py, because ultimately I don't want to change anything in the script. That script will work just fine for this exercise. Or we could start from scratch and implement the file plates.py. But since we've done this before, I'm going to go for option 1. However, if you've not watched the video on vanity plates that I made, I'm going to leave a link in the description below to enable you to do that. So this is what our previous file plates.py looked like. We have a function main, another function check start, another function len check, another function check numbers. And nicely enough, we wrote comments to explain the role of these functions. The function check start should check if the first 2 strings of the plate are letters. The function len check should check if the length of a plate is between 2 and 6 and at least 2 characters long. The function check numbers should check if numbers are in the middle of a plate. And lastly, the function is valid should check if a plate is valid. And in this function is valid, all we did was to call the previous functions. So I'm not going to go back to explain each of these functions in depth, but like I said, you can look at the video in the description to get a better idea of how the code works. And all I'll do here is just to copy all of these and come back to this file and paste it in here. And that's it for our file plates.py. I'm going to save these and I'm going to go to the file test underscore plates. And as always in this file, the first thing we need to do is to import plates and access the function is valid. And with this done, all we need to do next is to write a bunch of functions that are going to test the function is valid. And if you remember from the requirements of a valid vanity plate, we know that first of all, a plate should have at least 2 letters. Next, a plate should have a maximum of 6 characters, that could be letters and numbers. Next, though a plate could have numbers, there should be no numbers in the middle of the plate. Also, the numbers could not start with 0. And lastly, there should be no punctuation marks, commas or spaces or anything like that in a plate. So having that in mind, I'm going to go ahead and create the first function. I'm going to call this function test underscore letters, or rather test underscore 2 letters with no parameters. And in this function, I want to assert that is valid of say CS50 is equal to true. Then I'm going to copy this and paste it a number of times in this file. And as you'll notice, I've pasted this 9 times already. And so what I'll do is just to modify the function names and the behavior. And in this second function, I still want to check if a plate has at least 2 letters, but this time around I'm going to pass an input that should return false. Or modify the name of the function. Let me say test 2 letters 2. That might not be the best name, but I think that's fine. And instead of testing CS50, I'm going to check C5, and this should result to false. And this third function, I'm going to call it test underscore maximum numbers. So maximum letters, sorry. So test underscore max underscore letters. That's to test the maximum number of letters. And we know that the maximum number of letters should be 6, or rather the maximum number of characters should be 6. So instead of saying CS50 here, let's say hello. And this should return true. And in this fourth function, I'm going to pass in an input that should return false for maximum letters. I'm going to remove this and let's call this test of max underscore letters and 2. Yeah, not the best name, but that's fine. And instead of just saying CS50, let's say hello or uppercase. Hello without the spaces world, and this should result to false. In this other function, I'm going to check that there are no numbers in the middle of a plate. I'm going to modify this name, and instead of saying test underscore 2 letters, I'm going to call this test underscore mid for middle number. And I'm going to use a sample input that we saw online. In this case, I'm going to enter AAA222, and this should result to true. In this other function, I'll change this name to test underscore mid underscore number 2. Yeah, that name again, but that's fine. And I'll return here, or rather I'm going to check here AAA, let's say 22A, and this should result to false. So false. And still dealing with numbers, in this other function, I'm going to check that in case we have numbers in our string, or rather in our plates, the numbers do not start with 0. So I'm going to call this mid number 3. And I'm going to change the input here. I'm going to enter AAA, let's say 022. And this should result to false. Next on our list, in this function, I'm going to check for punctuation marks. I'll call this test underscore PSP for period, spaces, and punctuation marks. And I'm going to modify our input. Instead of checking CS50, let's say true with a space and then with a question mark. And this should result to false. And with this last function, I'm going to check if we have no input at all. I'm going to modify this name. Instead of saying test underscore 2 letters, let's say test underscore, or rather test 0 for test 0 input. And I'm going to come in here and remove all of this. And this should result to false. And with this, I think we've written enough tests. I'm going to save this file or open up my terminal, and we are going to run pytest of test underscore plates. If I press enter, and we have 9 tests passed in 0.01 seconds. And as you can see for yourself, all of these tests are actually valid tests. And if from the result of pytest, the function is valid past all of these tests, it definitely means that our function is behaving just right. So now let's go ahead and introduce a few bugs in this program and see what happens. For example, in this case, instead of entering 6, let's say we entered 60. That's a big number. So this would mean that the length of a vanity plate should be between 2 and 60. If I save this and I run this again, pytest of test underscore plates, we have 8 passed and 1 failed. And we can tell from the output of pytest that the function test underscore marks letters 2 failed. And if we think of the logic of the code, we understand that that's actually true, because if we look at that function test underscore marks letters 2, we realize that we told pytest that the test for hello world should be false, but this test resulted to be true because we changed the condition for the length of a vanity plate from a maximum of 6 to a maximum of 60. So if I go back in here and I move this 0, I save this again and I come back here and run this, if I press enter, we have 9 tests passed. So with this, we can all see that our code is okay and we've written enough tests to test the function is valid. I encourage you to play a little with this test. Try to fill all of these 9 tests, correct all the 9 tests, and then probably get a better understanding of how the code works. And if while doing that you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments section below and I'll be more than pleased to answer you. If you enjoyed the video, do well to hit the like and subscribe buttons, and I look forward to seeing you in my upcoming videos. That said, have a good day.